Okay, I think we can begin. Welcome to this evening's event, which is co-organized by Contemporary Turkish Studies and the European Institute. The event's title is behind me, Coalitions of the Willing in Action, the Role of Non-EU NATO Members in Europe's Security and Defense. I should also mention that this event is being funded and sponsored by Civica as well. Civica is the European University of Social Sciences, and thanks to Civica, we have Professor İlke Toygur with us today, who helped me organize this event, and so it's a joint organization with her. My name is Yaprak Gürsoy, and I'm Professor of European Politics and the Chair in Contemporary Turkish Studies here at LSE. Tonight, we will examine how Europe's security architecture is being reshaped in response to new collective threats and changes in US foreign policy, with a particular focus on the EU's pursuit of open strategic autonomy and the growing use of coalitions of the willing. We will primarily draw on the cases of Norway and Canada, and secondarily on the UK and Turkey. Our speakers will explore how the EU can more effectively engage its non-EU NATO partners to build a more unified and flexible, resilient European defense framework. I'm very pleased to welcome Erin McGill, Pernil Rieker, and İlke Toygur to discuss these matters with us. Unfortunately, as you can see, we have one speaker missing. In Bond couldn't make it today due to a personal emergency. Let me, however, briefly introduce the speakers who are here in the order that they are going to speak today. İlke Toygur is joining us from Madrid, where she is the director of the Global Policy Center and a professor of practice in European politics. And freshly, İlke has just become the visiting research fellow, visiting senior fellow with Contemporary Turkish Studies in the European Institute. Her expertise is on European integration, elections and democracy in Western Europe, European geopolitics, and transatlantic relations. In her initial intervention, İlke will talk about where we are in terms of European security structure and how we actually got here. The second initial speaker will be Pernil Rieker, who has arrived today from Oslo, where she's the director of the Arena Center for European Studies at the University of Oslo. She's also a research professor at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. Her research focuses on European integration and European foreign and security policy, including French and Norwegian perspectives, and she examines how strategic choices evolve within shifting European and geopolitical environments. Pernil will provide the Norwegian perspective on defense cooperation with the EU. Last but not least, we are joined by Erin McGill from LSE. Erin is the academic director of the MSc International Strategy and Diplomacy program at LSE Ideas. His research focuses on international order theory, and his current work examines the sources of international disorder and the means by which states order war. Erin is also a Canadian citizen, and today his talk will primarily focus on Canada-EU security and defense cooperation. So before I give the floor to our panelists, I just want to go over a few things in terms of the running order. First of all, if you haven't turned your phones on silent mode, please do so right now. Please also note that we are recording this event, and if we do not encounter any technical difficulties, we will make it available as a video and a podcast later. After the initial presentations of the speakers, we are going to have a second shorter round of questions amongst ourselves. Then we are going to open the floor to your questions. So if you have any questions, please wait until we start the Q&A session, and we will give the floor to you. After the panel, there will be a drinks reception outside. Please do stay for that to continue the discussion on a more informal setting. With that, Ilke, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yaprak. It's a pleasure being here, and also thank you for the warm welcome this week. It has been great to be at LSE and to use to make of the best of the Civica partnership that we have between IE University based in Madrid and LSE here in London. So I'm looking forward to also the upcoming weeks and months of engagement here at LSE. Actually, my intervention is going to focus on three parts, if we can say so. The first part is going to be more on how we got here. So what brought the European continent to this point, according to my perception. The second part is going to be focusing on the concept of coalitions of the willing, and also a bit introducing the security and defense partnerships as a major instrument of responding to this reality today. And thirdly, maybe opening up the discussion to conversations on UK, Norway, Canada, and Turkey, the rethinking of wider Europe in a broader sense. So this is a bit what I'm thinking. I think it is no secret now that Europe is facing the biggest security threat and security restructuring since the end of the Second World War. I personally see two major reasons for this, but of course there are many nuances there. The first one is Russian invasion of Ukraine, full-scale invasion in 2022, and this has reshaped, opened up many discussions about how Ukraine should be supported and how Europe must be defended if it comes to that. And secondly, and for me even equally significantly, is the Donald Trump's return to the White House. We already have various analysis on transatlantic affairs and Europe and US relations, but let me underline 2 points which I really feel that is significant in the rethinking of European security. Different than the first term, what we are seeing in the second term is that, because from the first term we know the trade issue, we know the shifting of responsibilities to European allies in NATO, we know the undermining of international organizations like NATO, but also Paris Climate Agreement, the World Health Organization. These parts are not necessarily a surprise for the Europeans. But there are two new elements for me that are significantly important. The first one is the clear undermining of the European integration process, both verbally, but also with actual support to the extreme right-wing movements in Europe. So there is an ideological breakup between the United States administration and the European integration project, which was there since the end of the Second World War. And secondly, and more clearly from this year, January 2026, is the threat to territorial sovereignty of Greenland, which is part of European territory via Denmark. And this has created for the first time the real conversations about preparations for a certain clash between the Europeans and the United States. This is the general context, but I think it is really important to put this general context first, because what we are seeing here and what leads to conversations about coalitions of the willing and partnerships is that right now threats evolve way faster than institutions. This is the first reality. And secondly, formal structures that we have both in the EU and also in NATO are either too slow or constrained via unanimity requirements, or in the third case, we really need non-EU member states as a part of the conversation. And this links me to the second part of my intervention. It's like why we are inventing new partnerships and new concepts like the coalitions of the willing. Maybe I can start with the SDPs in this case, because it's super striking that since 2024, the EU has signed 12 different agreements with partners in wider Europe and elsewhere. Like the examples run around Albania, Australia, Canada, Ghana, very recently, Iceland, India, Japan, Moldova, North Macedonia, Norway, South Korea, and United Kingdom. And these countries have very tailored, specific, flexible engagements with the European Union under the name of security and defense partnerships. This is a newly invented format, and maybe we can get back to that in a while, but this is kind of the European intention to open up this conversation to both wider Europe and other partners in the rest of the world. Then this is also complemented with this very sexy concept of coalitions of the willing, which shares some of the same characteristics. No, it's like now we are trying to define this also as a typology, and what we are using as a definition for coalitions of the willing is that they are flexible, ad hoc groupings of states that cooperate outside or alongside formal EU frameworks, distinguished from the established mechanisms of differentiated integration by their informality, speed, and purpose-driven nature. So we are seeing a new conceptualization in European security, which is new and not so new. Because who would remember the first use of coalitions of the willing that we can remember from the history? Anyone?
Was it the US with Iraq?
Very good. 2003, Iraq, and the European countries, EU and non-EU alike, so United Kingdom back then, well, it was back then EU member state actually. Now we are used to that, it's not, but back then, yes. The European countries that supported American efforts in Iraq were called Coalition of the Willing. The second use was anti-ISIS coalition. Not as exactly the same thing, but very similar. So it was used also back in the day. But today in Europe, it has become a catch-all concept, actually, for all kinds of intergovernmental engagements that are going in parallel to institutional structures. The most popular example is clearly the Ukraine coalition, which this country is also a part of. But we have many questions around this. If this is going to be a continuous effort, if so, who is going to be funding it? And if this is going to be more a permanent structure, what is it going to be the relationship between these constructions of coalitions of the willing with the EU and NATO? And from there, maybe I can come to the third part. I hope I'm doing fine with the time.
Doing perfectly well.
Perfect. On the rethinking of wider Europe, because this is also why we are here, no? In this current situation, due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also the US withdrawal from European security, we are seeing a certain need of rethinking the relationship between the institutions, EU, NATO in this case, but also the role of non-EU NATO partners, United Kingdom, Norway, Canada, and of course we can also introduce Turkey maybe in the Q&A part, on the European security. Because these partners are named very frequently, and as you would recognize, 3 of them already have a security and defense partnership with the EU. Canada actually is even included in the SAFE funding scheme, not the United Kingdom. We can also discuss why is that the case. But we are seeing a broader conversation, but different realization in the case of the partner countries on the ground. It is very clear from the European point of view that there is a broader understanding of European security, both on the conventional side, but also in hybrid threats. I don't know, Pernille, if you're going to get into this a bit more, but we are also thinking and talking about hybrid threats that cannot be dealt with only within European borders, only within NATO borders, but that would require all kinds of collaborations with the countries in the Western Balkans, in association trio, and other parts of Northern Europe, like Iceland and Norway. But also, we are seeing an ongoing conversation that if the entire responsibility of defending Europe lies in Europe, which is a real possibility at this point in time, who would be the actors, structures, institutions, and funding mechanisms that would enable that task of defending Europe? Of course, there are different theories, European pillar in NATO, different engagements in and around European Union, but there's also a broader conversation around European security with the partners. Maybe as a last remark from my side, because I want to make that point, I'm sure there will be questions about this. In my personal opinion, this didn't weaken the enlargement conversation, because in general, this is perceived as either or, no? Securitization or normative use of enlargement. And Pernil is also a very good expert, I'm sure you will add on top of that. But since Russian invasion of Ukraine, we are also seeing a fastening in the conversation on enlargement, very rapid decisions of candidacy status for Ukraine and Moldova, also increasing the engagement with Western Balkans, improvements in the negotiations. We are at the point where Montenegro even got, this week or last week, an official accession treaty writing commission. The people that are starting to write the accession treaty of Montenegro as maybe possibly the 28th member state. Of course, there are many political problems related to that, and we can discuss this. But I just want to finish on saying that the security conversation does not necessarily exclude the enlargement conversation, but I actually personally think the intersection of the two will also create different possibilities, different forms of engagement between non-EU and EU member states. I think I'm going to stop there and then continue the conversation.
Excellent. You finished before you used your
Then I'm
time.
perfect.
Yes. Please, Pernil.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to you, Yaprak, and also to LSE and the Contemporary Turkish Studies and European Institute for organizing this very timely event. And I think that the title of this event, Coalition of the Willing in Action, actually captures something very important about where European security is heading. And I will say a little bit of why I think that is the case, and also use Norway as an example for showing this, why this coalition of the willing perspective, which I think that you rightly pointed out, is not only coalition of the willing, you can also refer to it as ad hoc. Different flexible formats of different kinds. So it's not only kind of the coalition of the willing concept. It's a broader interpretation that I will make here. As I see it, we are no longer in a situation where European security can be understood through one institution alone. So NATO, of course, remain indispensable, and but the EU has also become much more important. But then again, many of the most relevant responses today in today's security challenges also take place in these more flexible formats: coalition of the willing, unilateral groupings, bilateral agreements, security and defense partnership, as you mentioned, industrial cooperation, and ad hoc support structures for Ukraine. So the question is not only what is Europe doing, it is also who calls the shots, so to speak, and how. But also, how can the EU and Europe integrate non-EU NATO members into this more flexible but still coherent European security and defense architecture? In Europe, there is still this old tension between expectation and capabilities, which is very much at the core of the debate. So on the one hand, expectations towards the EU and Europe have increased dramatically, especially since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and also the uncertainty now about future US security guarantees that has created a pressure for Europeans to assume greater responsibility for their own security and defense. And on the other hand, Europe's ability to act is still constrained by institution, politics, capabilities, budgets, and national sovereignty concerns. And it's likely to remain, this kind of tension is likely to continue for some time. So we have a situation where the ambition is high, the urgency is real, but the institutional architecture is still very much under construction. And the urgency of the situation means that we need to move faster than before, and maybe also be more creative in our solutions. So my argument would be this: European strategic autonomy, which has now become kind of a mainstream concept and no longer kind of so controversial, no longer so French maybe. This strategic autonomy is needed, but it's not necessarily achieved through a uniform EU integration. So it is, in my view, increasingly being built through differentiated defense integration, where also non-EU allies such as UK, Norway, Canada, and potentially also Turkey, maybe we'll come back to that, becomes important. So different countries participate in different ways, at different levels, and through different institutional arrangement, but they may still contribute to a broader European capacity to act. So as I see it, European defence is not developing around one single institutional model. Rather, it is developing through overlapping EU and non-EU frameworks, coalition of the willing, and flexible formats that include both EU member states and closely associated partners. And I genuinely think that this does not necessarily undermine European unity, which has been an argument that has been out there, that when you have these flexible formats, it will actually create more fragmentation. I don't think that this is necessarily the case. Rather, I think it can be a functional response to urgent security challenges, especially when uniform integration would be politically or operationally difficult, at least in the short term. It might be possible in the long term, but in the short term, it is more difficult. But when I say this is not to say that the EU is less important as a security actor. On the contrary, it has become the crucial institution in European security, and primarily for two reasons. The first is that European security today is not only about defense in a narrow military sense. It is also about industrial capacity, preparedness, resilience, cybersecurity, critical infrastructure, energy, maritime security, space, and the ability, of course, to support Ukraine over time, and the capacity to coordinate sanctions against Russia. And in all these areas, the EU has become much more central, and in part of this also more central than NATO. And secondly, in the area of defense, the EU also supports ammunition production, it finances joint procurement, it coordinates sanctions, it supports Ukraine, it works on military mobility, critical infrastructure, cybersecurity, space, preparedness, defense industry. So in other words, the EU is becoming a security actor not only through traditional crisis management operations, but through its regulatory, financial, industrial, and infrastructural power. Put it differently, the EU is becoming an enabling actor for strengthening European strategic autonomy. So in a way, we may identify three broad pathways for the future of European defense: a stronger European pillar within NATO, coalition of the willing that can move faster in crisis situations, and deeper cooperation inside EU structure through instruments such as PESCO, European Defence Fund, Joint Procurement Mechanism, and SAFE. But I think it's important to point out that these three pathways are not mutually exclusive. So we are likely to see all three at the same time. And that brings me also to Norway. Norway is a very closely associated non-EU ally. It is involved in all these three logics. Norway is a NATO ally. It participates in flexible formats such as the Joint Expeditionary Force together with the UK and Nordic Defence Cooperation, and Norway is increasingly linked to EU initiatives in security, defence, industrial preparedness and space through the partnership agreement that we signed 2 years ago. So from my perspective, coalition of the willing are crucial as they allow for Europe to move faster. They allow for non-EU NATO members to be part of this endeavour, and they also reflect the fact that European security is wider than the EU, but also more complex than NATO alone. But I would not frame the question as coalition versus integration. So I would rather ask how these coalition of the willing or these many flexible formats can be embedded in a broader European security order. They should complement NATO and the EU, not bypass them, and they should be open to relevant partners, but based on clear rules, and they should contribute to a more capable Europe and not a more fragmented one. So while this differentiated defence integration may be a way to achieve the objective of European security strategic autonomy, it is not always in the interest of the non-EU allies. And here I come back to Norway as an example, because it's clear that Norway's close relations to the EU through the EEA agreement, we are completely integrated into the internal market. We are part of Schengen, and we have 102 other agreements with the EU, so it covers more or less everything, everything except decision making. So we don't have a vote, but we participate in more or less everything. Of course, except fish and agriculture and a few sensitive things, the sticky stuffs, yeah, but still very much integrated. And this, of course, provides us an easier access than perhaps other non-EU allies, like the UK. We are in SAFE, we have the space and satellite communication agreement, but at the same time, it is a challenging positions to be at times, because there is a lot of uncertainty whether Norway will be included or not in the new initiatives that the EU is now taking. The health union, we struggle to get an agreement. We are inside the EEA, but we are outside the customs union, which makes it very difficult when now trade is becoming securitized. So that is a huge problem. And the other thing is that negotiations for new agreements takes time, and you don't have time in a crisis situation. So this is a challenge. And it's of course, and the kind of the main challenge is from a democratic point of view that we take on all the rules, but we are not part of the decision making. But this seems to be, acceptable for the Norwegian public opinion. It's more difficult to accept, I think, for some politicians and also for bureaucrats. But it has become a security challenge for Norway to have that kind of relationship to the EU, in my view. But as the EU develops new instruments in defense, industrial policy, economic security and preparedness, the question of third country participation is therefore becomes important. But additional agreements or associations to new instruments are not necessarily straightforward. Even for Norway, it's maybe more easy because we have this agreement as an entry point, but still it is difficult. And this was a lot easier before. The EU has changed a lot since we signed the EEA agreement in 1994. Then the EU had the pillar structure and we could have agreements. So the EEA agreement could be kind of singled out to the internal market, and we had agreement in all different policy areas. But now the new initiatives that comes from the EU comes in packages. And this pillar structure is no longer there since the Lisbon Treaty, but it creates much more a problematic structure how to get an agreement with a third country that works from a legal point of view and a lot of technicalities. So so this is So let me conclude with 3 points. First, European defence is not moving towards one single model. That's my kind of first point. It is developing through NATO EU instrument, coalitions of the willing, and these many different formats. And second, this flexibility is not necessarily a weakness. It may actually be the only realistic way to build European strategic autonomy fast enough in a more dangerous world. And third, integration is not, differentiated integration is not the same as full participation. So for the non-EU allies and the third countries always be kind of less than being a full member. So it will be good for European security, but not necessarily for the non-EU members.
Then come in.
It's not me to decide.
Great. Aaron.
All right, okay. So in preparing for this talk, I found the subtitle of the event to be quite interesting. We can see it on the screen, right? The role of non-EU NATO members in Europe's security and defense. What's interesting here is that the most important non-EU NATO member is the United States, of course, right? But the title and the composition of the panel obviously means the other states, right? Such as Britain or Turkey, Norway,
European states.
and Canada, right? Yeah, non-EU NATO member. Yeah. So I think that's kind of captures what the question of tonight's kind of talk is about, right? The question has become, at least in the European theater, how other states can take a lead in defending their freedom and prosperity, and if and when the US may join in, right? If need be. Right? That's a change, right? Since the Second World War and the onset of the Cold War throughout and after, how the US will uphold its responsibilities in defending the free world has been the question, and how we'll fit into that policy direction has been the question. It's changed. That's a big change, right? So I think it's useful to consider the political aspects of these issues in European defense. In grand strategy, the overarching political point is the question, right? What's all this defense spending for, after all, in the long run? So I've also been invited to bring in the Canadian perspective on this question, and I'll do so in my academic opinion from that angle. I'll look at Prime Minister Mark Carney's foreign policy, provide an assessment, discuss what his notion of rupture may mean, how deep it may be, and whether it's true, and what kind of international order may emerge in response. My argument, I think, if it is coherent enough, is that Europe cannot be a genuine great power without an integrated coalition of like-minded power multipliers. It is too small and too vulnerable relative to other powers, right? And an EU vision of open strategic autonomy is not the same thing as an international order vision. Europe has an interest and arguably a share in the responsibility of rebuilding an international order and shared interests, and Europe, moreover, can renew its historical purpose and meaning in the process. There can be no international order without a balance of power, but the balance of power does not add up to an international order. It has to be built on top. So there's a lot of work to do, as it were. On the other hand, alliance politics has never been easy, of course, right? Similar, if not the same debates were had in the Nixon years, right? When he and Kissinger called for a more multipolar arrangement and for European states to do more. There was a sense, nevertheless, at the time, that there were certain norms and rules that were mutually understood to matter, despite the crises and disagreements over the years. The order that the US led was never perfect or shared by everyone equally, and its critics will not miss it. But the difficulty today is that it's not clear what order, if any, comes next, right? So we come to Prime Minister Mark Carney's World Economic Forum speech, which was highly influential and discussed. The big idea we remember is that the international order we have relied on is undergoing rupture rather than transition. To quote his speech, "Rupture in the world order, the end is the end of a pleasant fiction and the beginning of a harsh reality, where geopolitics, where the large main power is submitted to no limits, no constraints." So the assessment for European and allied capitals is to ask what this claim means, how true it may be, and in what sense and in what depth. On the one hand, international relations have always been a space of great power politics within certain limits. The US has soft quit Europe today, but this is not new. It goes back at least to Obama. It's simply a consequence of the changing balance of power. The notion of US offshore balancing, reducing forced deployments, does not necessarily mean strategic decoupling. The US is still an interest in European stability. It just has other pressing issues elsewhere. On the other hand, genuine psychological damage has been made to the alliance, particularly by differences over Greenland. The US has, since the Second World War, been a great power, working in its great power interests, and its more naked expression of power interests today is not entirely unprecedented, but its consideration of more acquisitive and coercive approaches to its own allies is different and quite new. To be clear, the US has not acted on these acquisitive intentions, but the perception of threat from the US itself is rather new. So taken together, the question of how the US will defend the free world has shifted into if, when, where, and under what conditions. This is rather important. Mark Carney's not wrong to point this out. And European states have also got the message. There were two other ideas in his speech, however, in addition to this idea of rupture. First, the idea that the liberal international order has not only ruptured, but it was also for some time living within the lie, that it was kind of playing a make-believe. And secondly, Carney also suggested the order can also be rebuilt by the remaining powers, of the willing powers, as it were. On the first point, there is a grain of truth in it. The liberal order has, since at least around the crash, let's say, become kind of performance art. The joint statements were made, the photocols were done, but there was an unreality and an obvious dysfunction. It's true. The point is not unimportant, moreover, because it forces us to be honest about the political goals of any coalition of the willing. To be honest, restoring a liberal international order doesn't really make sense if it wasn't working in the first place. On the second point, then, rebuilding the order, can it be done? It's partly a question of deterrence, feasibility, and partly a question of, well, what kind of order a coalition is seeking to defend and advance. Right? Carney remarked, nostalgia is not a strategy. Yes. What I'm yet to hear is a clear articulation of a forward-looking international order vision from any Western state, or at least a loud and clear one. Today, it's interesting that so many states are willing to pitch in and fit in together with EU states and common defense arrangements. The political will is there, and Canada is amongst them, right? It remains invested in a free, open, and peaceful Europe, including Ukraine, and Canada has shared interests and vulnerabilities in the Arctic. Canada has a new range of dizzying policies towards that end. It is hedging, as it were, rather than bandwagoning with the United States, and I think that's going to be a consistent policy for Canada for some time. It's meant to be a long-term, deeper security relationship with Europe. There's the Security and Defense Partnership of June 2025. It has a huge list of security areas and domains of partnership. The new industrial defense strategy of Canada has a build, partner, buy approach, and Europe and the UK are prioritized for strategy of a partnership, procurement partnerships. Canada also participating in SAFE and readiness. It's contributed $500 million to the European Space Agency. And since 2022, of course, it's committed $6.5 billion in military assistance to Ukraine. Right? So the intentions are to deepen long-term security relations. The coalition of middler intermediate powers like Canada, however, is not the same quantity or quality of contributions from a great power like the United States. Let's be honest, right? Arguably, with time and investment, a coalition, nevertheless, can be sufficient to deter Russia because it's the weakest of the great powers and shows signs of decline, quite obvious ones. Without deeper integration, however, between EU and non-EU NATO member states, there's a sense that the divide and rule strategies would be easy to tear them apart from one another. Any great power can divide up a coalition of small powers if they're not deeply integrated. On the other hand, the US will remain relevant, right? I'm not saying it's not relevant, and NATO itself should not be abandoned or thought to let rot or something like that. It should be updated, invested in, even if the EU itself may do more on its own. And even while the US is seeking to reduce its footprint in Europe, the Western alliance matters, even if it's troubled, and it remains essential. It's imaginable in a decade that Europe may become a genuine geopolitical power in its own right with multi-regional force capabilities if investments are made in a durable, long-term way. But it needs to be realistic that it would nevertheless be one amongst several other powers in the world, right? Any engagement with Africa, Latin American, Southeast Asian states would be in competition with these other powers in the making of any international order. A coalition of middle powers, even if deeply integrated and developed, cannot realistically save or restore a liberal international order if the other powers don't want it. Right? So to close, there's a need to make something new out of the old. Internationalism is not the same thing as globalism. EU states have an interest and a shared responsibility of contributing to and rebuilding an international order in shared interests, and the EU cannot do so without its closest friends and partners. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much to all three of you. I think I'm going to ask you some questions. I want to, first of all, really go back to Ilke's promise to talk about Turkey more. You never promised, but you mentioned it and you said maybe we can talk about it in the Q&A. So, I want to ask you, where do you see the relationship between Turkey and the EU going, and whether the EU can afford not to include Turkey in a security or defense partnership? Your future kind of projections in that relationship. To Pernille, I mean, I want to ask you, you did touch upon this a little bit, but about Norway's neighborhoods in general. So both in terms of other Nordic states and the Baltic cooperation, because there are shifts occurring with the Russian threat in Norway's neighborhoods. Iceland is considering becoming a member of the EU. There's going to be a referendum. Finland and Sweden joined NATO. There's Nordic-Baltic cooperation, but you know, what does all of this mean for Norway and Norway's future engagement with the EU and with its neighbors? And to Aaron, I want to ask, because I think you did outline Canada's kind of perspective at the moment, based on the Prime Minister's speech. But in your expert opinion, where do you think this relationship should go on a more like normative question? Because we've also seen that Canada was the guest country for European Political Community recently, which was quite a historical event. But do you think that the relationship can go deeper, and should it go deeper? I mean, there is, of course, the entire ocean between Canada and the EU. So, you know, just your thoughts on these questions. Maybe we can take the same order as the initial interventions and start with Ilke. Yeah.
Thank you, Yaprak, for this, for bringing in this very interesting and complex partner for the EU. Actually, I personally see Turkey's case a bit different than the United Kingdom, Norway, and even Canada, and we could start from the complex relationship with Turkey and the EU and its candidate status, the frozen relationship. But I'm not going to even start from there. I'm going to start from 2022, because when Russia invaded Ukraine, I think Turkey positioned itself in a very strategically ambiguous position. No, it started hedging between the two. It is helping Ukraine with weaponry and ammunition. There's a defense industry cooperation. It has never joined the sanctions against Russia. It has actually even helped out Russia to circumvent the sanctions. It has already repeatedly documented by the EU officials that has widened the gap between the strategic priorities of Turkish foreign policy and European foreign policy, and regardless of its candidacy status, the alignment between the two sides of foreign policy decreased to amounts of around 15%, according to the latest reports from the European Commission. I think it's 17, the exact number. So from the European point of view, there is a major lack of common understanding of security threats, and also lack of alignment when it comes to the priorities in the European continent. So from the European point of view, this creates a major problem in taking the next step, like signing a security and defense partnership and institutional opening up to Turkey to have a conversation. If we look from the Turkish point of view, of course, there are also all kinds of grievances. If there was another colleague from Turkey, I'm sure they will mention the issue of Cyprus, how Cyprus is not letting them get closer to European security and defense structures, etc., etc. So you would see from two sides different perspectives. But since we are discussing about the restructuring and rethinking of European security, I see two areas of cooperation with Turkey. The first one is, of course, the European pillar inside NATO. There you can not have Turkey, no? But the tension will always be there, because Turkey prevents NATO from sharing strategic information and priorities and assessments with the EU because of the Cyprus issue. And Cyprus prevents further institutional alignment with Turkey, and even indirectly NATO, because of the bilateral tensions. But Turkey is there. So in any kind of conversation about NATO's European pillar, Turkey is there, and after the United States, actually Turkey is the second biggest army inside NATO. So there is an obvious existence there. And the second part is the defense industry cooperation. Turkish defense industry is strong. Many member states, including Spain, Italy, Germany, and others, they have an interest in collaborating with the Turkish defense industry. And also Turkey has an easier, quicker, and cheaper production capacity of ammunition and weaponry in some cases. The key question there is going to be standards, because when the Americans set the standards and the weaponry, then it was kind of easier to align. When Turkey bought S-400s from Russia, the question became very complex. So now we need more defense industry experts to analyze if the future collaboration may include Turkey or not, taking into consideration also the differentiation inside European procurement. Now we have South Korean weaponry inside Europe. So what is this going to be? Is Turkey going to be like a provider like South Korea? Is it going to be Europe, EU-funded collaboration between Turkey and the member states for cheaper and quicker and closer to European shore defense cooperation? I think these are open questions. But just to end up on that note, for me, from my personal academic point of view, the lack of strategic alignment is a major issue. And this will come back. This will come back. Even if from a rational point of view, Turkey cannot be sidelined, the lack of strategic alignment moving forward is going to be important, because at the end of the day, the European continent is also doing this because it is trying to diversify from the United States, try to create a common ground for a possible threat from Russia. For that, you need to have this common threat perspective. I really cannot see how this might happen otherwise.
Okay.
Can I use one more minute to respond to something that he has said?
Yes.
Because this US soft quitting is not new is an argument that I really question personally, because it's real. It has happened since Obama. They wanted to shift the responsibility to Europeans, yes. But this is I would claim the first time, but you will correct me as a person that looks at the history. This is the first time there is a direct ideological and territorial threat from the most important ally of the European Union to its interests. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it is really different than soft quitting, in my opinion.
That's
Yeah.
correct, yes. On
Yeah.
the one
Thank you very
hand,
much.
but on
So
the
you
other.
can reply.
You respond to me in your...
Do you want to go now, and then panel actually can be the last one to go,
Okay.
if you want to? Yeah.
How deep Canadian-European relations
Yeah,
should go, right. Right. On the one hand, Europe itself could adopt a very transactional approach, right? It could be a transactional actor too. While on the other, the idea is to integrate with like-minded states, right? So Carney's remark at the mentioned summit, which I think was last week, he noted that Canada is the most European non-European country, even more so than the United States, with a triple alignment of history, values, and trust. He also re-articulated his argument that the order will need to be rebuilt, but he stated that it will need to be rebuilt out of Europe if the United States isn't the source of it. He noted that strategic autonomy applies to a range of supply and resource chains, as it always has in food and energy and defense munitions. But he included additional things like critical minerals, space communications, and so on, that Canada has plenty to offer. The aim in the current Canadian strategy is to deepen integration beyond defense, right, and additional facilitating strategic resources, and to scale it up as well. There's no formal process for any EU membership, but any additional defense arrangements outside and complementing NATO should consider Canadian participation, and the Canadians, I think, would be lining up to participate and intend to do so for a long time, with deeper integration of all the additional things that come along with a first-rate military force. Yeah. So I think that it's it's a long-term relationship that they would like to go for. Yeah.
Do you want to answer Ilke's question in more detail, perhaps?
Right. Yeah. I don't get me wrong. Right. So the psychological damage from differences over Greenland are severe. The new approach to foreign policy domestically in Europe, but also in Latin America, is a bit concerning. Also in Canada. So that, I grant you, is new. Right. So that is very new. So that has created a tension in the resolve of the United States to defend the free world. Yeah.
Okay, good. Spanish, please.
Okay, thank you. So Norway's neighborhood. Yeah, well, of course, for Norway, for all the Nordic countries and the Baltic countries, the invasion of Ukraine was a huge shift, and all these countries having borders to Russia is, of course, very dramatic. And this dramatic shift, it led to a huge shift in Swedish and Finnish security and defense policy, that they actually made a decision very, very quickly to join NATO. It's particularly surprising in Sweden, because Sweden has more of always had a more ideological approach to its non-alignment, and this is part of its identity. In Finland, they have more of a kind of strategic approach to it. So for them, it was easier to, or at least it was easier to understand that shift that they would do. That was more predictable. In Sweden, it went from a very, I don't know exactly the percentage, but now I think it's 80-90% in favor of NATO membership, and it was very, very low. It was comparable to Norway's public opinion polls when it comes to EU. So this was really a huge shift, and of course that has had enormous implication also for Nordic cooperation in security and defense. When it comes to Nordic and Baltic cooperation, when it comes to this cooperation between the Nordic countries, Nordic have had very strong cooperation since the 1950s in all areas. So the Nordic is a very kind of integrated region with the passport union, common labor market. So it's really a region with also common language, especially in Scandinavia. Finland has a different, Finnish is very different, but all the Scandinavian countries can understand it. So this culturally and politically has it been very, very integrated. But now, with this shift, it was also possible to cooperate also in security and defense, and it had already started in the 1990s and the beginning of 2000. After the end of the Cold War, but with all countries in NATO, it was possible to cooperate much more closely. But then, now that you see that the EU has taken on a more important role, then Norway has become kind of the outsider. The outsider. And it makes it more difficult still. So it has solved some problems when it comes to planning, and everything that is NATO related is much more easier now to cooperate. So on military planning and so on. But when it comes to kind of other security issues, it's more difficult. Or it's more difficult, it's not more difficult, but it's still difficult. And the reason why it's difficult is, of course, that the Nordic countries will give priority to their cooperation in the EU and not necessarily the Nordic forum. So it creates a problem for, so it's kind of, it's stronger on some parts, but it will not be totally solved before Norway also, I think, will be fully integrated. And it comes back to the challenges for Norway that I already mentioned. The fact that we kind of so integrated, but struggles to be part of space cooperation or health union or kind of the trade instrument, economic security, all of these things that are now important instrument for security in a broader sense. Yeah. So this creates challenges. And then you mentioned Iceland. So you want me to say a little bit about that? Yeah, of course. Now it's interesting what Iceland will do. I mean, if Iceland, they will have a referendum, I think in the end of August, if the date will not be changed, to reopen the negotiation with the EU. And if that happens, of course, it will be Norway and Liechtenstein in the EEA agreement, which will be a bit odd. Norway will be the superpower in that relationship. Of course, Iceland is not very big either, but at least there is a little bit more balance. And but there will be, and if the EEA, it's possible to uphold the EEA agreement with Liechtenstein and Norway. That remains to be seen. I think that most people think that there is possible to find a solution, but still, I think if Iceland join or decide to reopen, that may trigger a debate in Norway as well. But it's very difficult to start a debate on EU membership in Norway. It has been a kind of traumatic.
Would you say it's like a taboo?
Yeah, it is a taboo. It has been a taboo since 1994, and no political leadership or the kind of main political parties have been willing to address that issue or to kind of start a debate of fear of losing votes. So it hasn't been a debate. It's very little knowledge about the EU. It's not really talked about. But it's starting a little bit now. And what, of course, I mean, now we have had so many crises. So it's maybe a bit strange that we haven't kind of started talking about it. But I think the election of Trump last year or in 2024, that changed kind of. But it is a very slow change. But I think there is a kind of feeling that now it's more dramatic and that we need to kind of cooperate more closely with our European neighbors and not only kind of, and especially in these areas where we struggle to have agreements which is kind of close to the security concerns of Norway. So I think that it might be a debate coming up. And not only, I mean, Iceland may trigger that, but I think even though Iceland will not decide to reopen the negotiation, I think that some kind of debate will come in Norway as well.
Yeah, we'll be watching.
We will be watching.
So thank you very much. I have some further questions, but we need to leave time for the Q&A. But before I open the floor to the Q&A, I'm perfectly aware of the fact that we haven't really touched upon the UK. But we are very lucky to have Mr. Ruben Rees in the audience. Sorry for putting you on the spot, but Ruben is the head of Turkey section in the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. And I asked him to perhaps talk a little bit about UK-EU partnership, security partnership, and UK-Turkey partnership, and what that means for European security in general. So if you can say a few words, we would really appreciate it, to give us an update of what's happening there.
Sure. Thanks so much, for inviting me this evening. I'll keep it quite brief. The UK and Turkey have been contributing to European security long before NATO or the EU were established. We've had coalitions at different times throughout history. So this is nothing new, really. I think for us, it's a return to previous structures, more agile formats and alliances. For the UK, we established diplomatic relations with the Ottoman Empire as England in 1583. And since then, as in all relationships, we've had our ups and downs. But today, the UK and Turkey are leading European NATO allies who enjoy an historic friendship and share deep mutual respect and understanding. And that understanding is underpinned by a shared commitment to European security, to prosperity and regional stability. And it's a partnership that continues to directly contribute to European security today. The Strategic Defence Review identifies Turkey as a key NATO ally and bilateral partner for the UK, imperative to our security interests, and nobody can deny Turkey's strategic position, sitting at the crossroads between the Black Sea, the South Caucasus, the Middle East and Africa. To quote Foreign Minister Fidan a couple of weeks ago, we're in a difficult position, and that's geographically rather than purely in a geopolitical sense. But for the UK and Turkey, our military integration and defence industrial collaboration has really entered a new era over the past 12 months. Last March, Turkey joined the first summit of the Coalition of the Willing to support a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. And alongside the UK and other European partners, Turkey has played a key role leading that coalition, particularly on the maritime track. And I think it would be remiss of me not to note that it was Turkey that exercised its powers under the Montreux Convention in 2022 to close the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits to all military shipping, but particularly the Russian Black Sea Fleet, and that directly, in our view, contributed to the functional defeat of the Russian fleet by Ukraine later that year. Last autumn, the Prime Minister and President Erdogan signed a landmark contract for the sale of Eurofighter Typhoon jets. That £8 billion contract brings Turkey into a flagship European defence consortium, which will strengthen NATO's collective defence. And now, looking ahead to the Ankara summit, we continue to deepen our cooperation alongside our European partners to build a more European NATO, to strengthen European defence industry, and to continue making a concrete contribution to European security at a time of uncertainty for our continent. And if I may, just to quote the great founder of the Turkish Republic, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, he once said, "We derive our inspiration not from heaven or from an unseen world, but directly from life itself." And when we're thinking about strategic alignment, I dwell on that quote because it's more than an abstract functional analysis. It's a living, breathing relationship between the UK and Turkey, between the UK and the EU, and we need to lift our sights at this moment and think about what's in all of our collective interest for European security. And I think I'll stop there in terms of a summary of our cooperation.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate that very short intervention. I think we needed it. And so with that, we can open the floor to questions. Please do wait for the roving mic, raise your hand, and please do not forget to introduce yourself. Yes, at the back, we have one question.
Thank you very much. Tim Chattel from Chatham House, where I'm the British Army's visiting research fellow and focusing on Turkey's role in contemporary European security. Recently, when we hosted Hakan Fidan at Chatham House, he mentioned that the crisis in European security has given a new urgency to projects that Turkey has often advocated. But recently, in the last couple of days, an unnamed foreign ministry official has told Turkey Recap that there seems to be little reciprocity and a sense of one-sidedness in Turkish approaches to Europe on the field of defence cooperation. To what extent does the current climate allow for potentially an innovative approach to issues of contention that are long-standing between Turkey and Europe? And is there a role for NATO to potentially arbitrate between some of the long-standing issues, particularly in the Aegean or on Cyprus? Thank you very much.
Okay, shall we take a few more questions, perhaps? Yeah. And there's one over there, and then one over here. So 2 questions. Yes.
My name is Rosanna. I'm a master's student at SOAS. I wanted to ask, obviously with Turkey, I think the sort of coalition is practical given the resources that the country also has. However, I wanted to look into sort of like the smaller Europe, maybe the countries around the European Union, especially like in the Western Balkans. You touched upon Albania, and I was wondering, given the country, would it then become more of a liability rather than a resource for the defense for the European Union? And if that were the case, then because of the possible coalition, do you think that there may be expectations from the European Union, from countries around the Western Balkans, if they were to get involved within the defense system?
Okay. Great. Yes, please. You have the microphone. Okay, good.
I'm Oscar Andrea, and I'm a student of international political economy here. I have a question for Dr. Riakir, specifically regarding the Norwegian case. Given that the EU is so critical for the managing of economic security concerns and also procurement policy in the EU, why do you think it's so hard for politicians in Norway to sell these very important things to the Norwegian public and leaving them to focus on such marginal issues that really, in the big picture scheme of things, doesn't really matter that much?
Shall we make an attempt to answer these questions? Perhaps, Ilke, you can take the Turkey and Western Balkan questions.
Sure. Thank you for the questions, and also Ruben, thank you for your remarks, because actually the UK's point of view is very exemplary in the relationship with Turkey and very different than the EU's approach as such. So Turkey actually has an ally here, and from the Turkish point of view, that's a very positive thing, because if the non-EU continental allies would like to challenge the European Union, Turkey has the United Kingdom on its side, and I think it's kind of a positive thing from a Turkish point of view, no? But I think what you have underlined is very important on the functional thing. This is a bit the point that I was trying to make in the NATO case. Like, there might be all kind of ideological, strategic, and abstract. You mentioned them as abstract. For me, they're not abstract, but there might be more meta-level discussions on European security. But then on the ground and on the functional level, operational level, and at the industry level, there is a different picture that also includes Turkey, as I have also mentioned. But if we connect these comments to the lack of reciprocity question that the colleague from the Chatham House has asked, it really boils down to the strategic alignment issue. It might sound meta-level or abstract, but from Brussels' point of view, or from some of the member states' point of view, even if they acknowledge the necessity to include Turkey because of the geographical location, because of the historical relationship, because of its position in NATO, there are so many question marks in the strategic realm that makes them go back. I have been in so many debates in the External Action Service. There were colleagues on the meta level looking for institutional cooperation, a way forward in Turkey relations, the unlocking, or whatever we want to call that, the relationship, but it always becomes very difficult. The strategic question, the democracy question in the country, the lack of common understanding between the EU member states and Turkey, and literally, it's like the problem of seeing eye to eye in threat perceptions is the reason, in my opinion, why this is not moving forward. But again, there's an issue related to Cyprus, which has not been resolved. European Union accepted Cyprus as a member state without resolving the continental territorial problem in Cyprus, and this has been haunting the relationship since then, since 2004. So this is another issue that is really making it a big deadlock, and maybe from the Turkish point of view, this would be the source of the problem, and the lack of strategic alignment would be the source of the problem from the European point of view. And unless you bridge them and come up with concrete solutions to this, you wouldn't be able to solve the issue, especially on the institutional side, the relationship side. And let me add maybe one more point. If we come to a point where we are discussing some kind of associate membership, or some kind of differentiated integration with other countries, Ukraine and others, as a step towards full membership, we will come back to the same discussion on Turkey over and over again. Because we will see the lack of the institutional form of relationship problem being very present in this issue as well. And one point on the Western Balkans, or maybe even broader candidate countries discussion, this is interesting. No? It's like we have the enlargement process. Some of these Western Balkan countries signed up security and defense partnerships. You mentioned Albania. But looking from a European security and defense point of view, the country that really matters is Ukraine. Both for helping it defend itself today, but also for the innovative defense industry that it has today, the next generation, even next generation weaponry capacity, but also combat capacity that it has on the ground is unique in Europe. So I think there will be a real effort to integrate Ukraine and Ukrainian defense industry to European security. That's the only country where I see there is a conscious effort, and there will be a conscious effort in integrating. I think the others are more of a question of spheres of influence, security in the connectivity case, security in supply chains case, etc., etc. So the broader definition of security, but not necessarily the traditional security conversation is equally applicable to the case of Western Balkan countries in comparison to Ukraine.
Thank you. Pernille?
Yeah, Norway-EU relations. Yeah, well, why it's so difficult to... if I knew, I would tell them, but no, I think it's... I mean, the thing is that I mean, as I said, it is a taboo. It's not talked about. I think that's the problem, because they are so afraid of kind of losing votes on this issue. It's so sensitive. And the reason why it's so sensitive, I mean, this is a vicious circle. When you don't talk about it, people don't know what the EU is really about, and it is this kind of image that the EU is something very different than it really is. So it's a lot of misunderstandings. It is a kind of a conception of a market liberal EU from kind of 80s or something. It hasn't really shifted. So it hasn't really kind of followed the development of the EU over the past 30 years. So I think that is one thing. It also has something to do with Norwegian history and identity. I mean, we have been 400 years, I mean, it's way back, but still 400 years under Denmark and then in union with Sweden. And I think that is still kind of, to be part of a union for many people is still kind of challenging. So I think the main thing is still that there is no political leadership kind of saying that this is important for Norwegian security, economy, and economic security, as you say, that all these. And it hasn't been really felt as a huge problem, because since we are so integrated, we are kind of traveling freely in Europe, we are part of Schengen, we roam like home. I mean, everything works very smoothly. We can go to all the countries in Europe and apply for work as any other EU citizen. So it's... I think that is, and the Norwegian economy works very well. So I think for the people, it's not really seen as a necessity. But I think the security argument is going to kind of be the main thing, that people will, I mean, and the politician will have to talk about this, because this is going to be a huge challenge.
Okay. Any other questions? Oh,
Wow.
oh, what happened? Okay,
Wow.
I'm going
Like
to
8?
actually choose my students as the first person to ask questions.
Literally, like there are like 8 questions.
Yes.
Thank you. So good evening, Jules Lemaire. I'm also a student here, as you now know. Recently, especially since the Greenland episode, various scholars in the think tank made some pieces about how to replace or think of a replacement of NATO. Thinking, for instance, of a Canadian scholar, Justin Massey, that said that, for instance, we could think about like a network of intertwined coalitions of the willing. And so I wanted to hear your views on that, especially considering really, so taking the title of the talk, in action, so thinking about, for instance, interoperability, standards, and like really practical things, or more, as one of you mentioned, a way to complement NATO as like a broader European security architecture? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And we will get some more questions, but I will ask everybody to be very quick, okay, with the questions. We have a
No
lot of
pressure.
questions. Okay, right here at the back, please.
I need more water.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to ask the question. I'd rather, you argued that with the...
What's your name? Can you
sorry,
just-
sorry. Yeah. My name is Elijah. I am a MSc student here at LSE. I think that with the Turkey and the withdrawal, for example, of Russia from Syria in 2024, what we've seen, it kind of crystallized what Turkey's foreign policy objectives might be, that they have their own interest, regional interest. With the United States, I believe that's they basically want to shift the burden of security to European countries. And in Ukraine, I'm from Ukraine myself, and we see that there's a growing understanding of European states that it's cheaper to basically pay for the security right now in Ukraine rather than maybe possibly fight the future war like in Europe. Would you think that this will probably sort of force states like the UK or other non-EU NATO members to basically integrate and then maybe revitalize projects of like European army or something like comparable to European defense cooperation that we've seen back in the day? Because in the end, like essentially it's in Europe's, it's Europe's problem that it has to solve.
Yeah, okay, thank you. We can take one question from here. I cannot see you guys, so if you have a question, please do wave.
There are like 5 here.
frantically. I know. I'm trying to take every part of the room. There is one question over there.
Whatever you prefer.
Yes, please.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Miriam Kichuk. I work in politics and parliament within peace. My question is about Europe, more like specifically. I think Dr. McKeel, you mentioned it, and Dr. Toygod, you also mentioned it a little bit, but to what extent or how does division or fragmentation within Europe affect these coalitions in action?
Okay. I think we can take 2 more questions, right? Yes, I see you. Please go ahead.
I will take them all, and then we answer whatever we can.
Okay, okay. They've just decided that we'll take all the questions and then they'll choose which ones to ask. Yes, please go ahead.
Kevin Newman, I'm an independent researcher. I think it was Ilka who mentioned funding mechanisms. 2 wonderful words. Where do we get the fiscal space at the national and pan-European and global levels to bring up this necessary level of additional expenditure on defence and security?
Good. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Huang. I'm a master's student at NOC Ideas. I'm actually an Aaron student. So my question is, you had mentioned that Trump has done damage both on the integration of EU and also on the territorial integrity of European countries. But for me, perhaps the short and mid-term quickest and most realistic solution for Europe's security and defense is to keep the US in, to keep to make Trump change his mind, to make US prioritize European security again. That's probably the quickest solution. Do you think a coalition of the willing can do that, can change his mind?
Okay.
Maybe the
Good
Chinese
question,
leader
yeah.
can.
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Gunay and I'm a law student. My question is, why is Canada able to be a member of the Security Action for Europe initiative, while Turkey, who is an important and integral member of the EU, is excluded from such an initiative? And what sort of signals does this send Turkey? And does it not just reaffirm the belief that Turkey will not join the EU club and push them to look eastwards? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, good. One more?
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't see you. Yeah.
My name is Tom. I'm a bachelor student at UCL. My question is about Canada. So Canada has been strengthening its relationship with EU recently. For example, they signed an agreement last year about defense and its participation in ECP last week. How likely do you think that is to affect US-Canada relations, since US is quite interested in keeping that relationship and being involved in security decisions around the world in general?
Mm-hmm. There's one more.
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
okay.
Thank you very much. My name is Jan. I'm also a master's student at the European Institute. And my question is regarding the European Defence Union, I think it was called. It was proposed by Andreas Kubilius, I think last month. And my question is, do you think it is like a good tool right now to get a new, maybe treaty-based organization for European defence, or should we rely more on like flexible instruments like coalitions of the willings or other flexible tools? Thank you.
I think we're done, right? I even put on my glasses, but they don't seem to help much. So we have I can see the clock. We have 9 minutes. That means that, yeah, you have 3 minutes each to answer all of the questions. So Aaron, should we start with you?
Sure. I mean, 8 questions. Fantastic. Replacing NATO. I mean, I think the idea, even going back to the 80s, is to build a NATO in NATO. Who mentioned this question? That's the point. Build a NATO in NATO in case, right? That's the point. Don't replace it. Have some plan B. An EU army is an EU question. The Norwegians will fight for so forth. I mean, I think getting ahead is getting started, right? Differentiated defense is fantastic. I mean, just an EU army that's perfectly integrated and so forth may be just so ambitious that not worth it, right? And European divisions is kind of like the question on Canada-US relations. I think the point there is that threat perception from Washington is new. It's unusual in Canada. The electoral outcome, I think, suggests that Canada's not going to flip and become a bandwagoning state with the United States, which what the alternative party was suggesting. They had no Ukraine policy. They had an Indo-Pacific policy. And I don't think that's coming back due to electoral changes. US-Canada relations, it's a hedging relationship. Canada's participating in North American defense as much as it is participating in European defense. It is in a close relationship with the US for the time being, right? And bringing the US back to Europe is infeasible because of the balance of power. Europe is not where the action's at, unfortunately for the United States. It's not a simple temperament question. It's a balance of power, structural question. I think there's quite a lot of questions here, but I think that covers some of them.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Ilke?
Thank you. Great questions. Thank you very much. 2 points from my side. I think this US change his mind is not only the logic that we could have in Donald Trump's time, because it's mainly impossible, but it's in the next election, it's going to be actually 20 years since Obama years that we have started to see that the priorities for American security do not lie in Europe but lie elsewhere. So this is not just one administration's shift. The only thing that I have also mentioned in my initial remarks, before we were thinking this is burden shifting, this is divorce on friendly terms. Today we are thinking this is not necessarily friendly anymore, and there might be undermining of the integration project coming from the United States. So this is the key shift. But shifting priorities of the US foreign policy was already there, and as I said, in the next election it's going to be 20 years already. Maybe 2 short comments on the European Security Council, which is Kubilius's proposal, and the funding approach. I think this is all open. There will be all kinds of questions on what is going to work to today's challenges, and coalitions of the willing are the response to this. Not flexible, agile, whoever wants to be in can be in. But if we think on mid to long term, actually funding will define a lot of this, because sustaining an initiative will require national/institutional funding, and whoever becomes a more important player in the initiatives will also set the tone. And from my point of view, the initiatives will be more linked to the European Union if there is joint borrowing, joint procurement, joint payment, encouragement to member states, like safe instrument, but in a way bigger scale. Then we will see more orbiting initiatives around the European Union and its funding. And if the funding remains limited, we will see more ad hoc groupings and more flexible alliances. But the conversation of opening up European security to non-EU members already started with the European political community and will continue around the debate of European Security Council. But I think the engagement is positive. No, having this conversation in a broader scale is positive. Then the long-term implementation will require institutionalization and funding.
Okay, I'll start with this keep US in. I think that this is, as Tilke said, 20 years now, it has been kind of a shift in US policy, but I think still there is a willingness and hope that the US will still be there. The thing is that we cannot be sure, and when we're not sure, then the deterrence will not work, so there has to be a plan B. But I think we will not kind of leave completely the idea of return of the US, but we cannot count on it. So I think, and that comes back to, European army. I've never really liked the kind of term of European army. I don't think that will ever happen, and I don't know really, I cannot see it, how that will look like. So I think that there will be, and we will not see probably the end of NATO, but we will see a change of NATO. We will see probably a more Europeanized NATO. And I think also that what I said in my introduction is that we see more and more kind of differentiated defense integration, and that is kind of a step in the direction towards something that you could call a European army, but it will be in the long term, especially for the reasons, for what you mentioned, that there is fragmentation, there are different kind of opinions in the EU and in Europe, which makes it difficult to go all the way when it comes to defense integration and have a uniform defense integration. And of course, when it comes to funding as well, that would have solved the problem if we went all the way towards kind of a full defense integration in Europe. I mean, if we are looking at all the funding that we do individually in each countries, we spend quite a lot of money on defense, and kind of pooling these resources together, we could have a very strong European defense. But of course, this is not going to happen in that way. So we need to have kind of this plan B, and I think it's getting more and more urgent. And this is why I think that going towards it in a more differentiated defense integration is the best way to achieve it in the short term.
Great.
Yeah, and I think also when it comes to the US, it also has to do with values. I mean, now the US is really drifting away, not only not willing to support Europe, but is also going kind of in a different way when it comes to fundamental values that still the European countries share, at least for now, most of them. So, yeah.
All right, thank you very much to our panelists. Before we close this session, I would like to also thank very much our events team, the European Institute events team. Arzu Kurdal Şahin, who is not here today, but she's been working in the background. We have Laura here, who has been in charge of everything on the day, and we have two wonderful students, Raquel and Isabella. We genuinely thank you for all your efforts. And thank you to all of you who are in the audience with your questions for coming here. Thanks to Ruben as well for the short intervention. If you've enjoyed this, please do, follow our events for the European Institute and also Contemporary Turkish Studies. We have an event coming up at Cambridge in July. It's the biannual political economy workshop on Turkey, and we will have Professor Melanie Comet coming from Harvard University to give the keynote lecture for that. And then, of course, thank you very much to all of you. This was very enjoyable. Thanks for coming from different parts of Europe and from across the campus in London. And this was a delightful discussion. We can continue with our discussions in the reception. Please do give a round of applause to our panelists.